November the 3rd, 1840, the Egyptian defenders of the ancient fortress city of Acre on the Syrian coast stared out to sea. Sailing towards them was a combined fleet of three major powers: the Austrians, the Ottoman Turks, and the British Royal Navy. At precisely 2 p.m, the fleet opened fire. In the next 2.5 hours, they unleashed 48,000 shells on the defenders. In a region that's seen more than its fair share of warfare, this action is little more than a footnote. But what was this bombardment all about? And why were the British there? This is the complex and little-known story of yet another flare-up in the Middle East which dragged in outside powers: a Habsburg prince and a maverick Royal Navy officer. This is the story of the Bombardment of Acre in 1840. The city of Acre, also pronounced as Acre, now in modern-day Israel, was in the 19th century part of the Ottoman Empire's province of Syria. The ancient city, which had been fought over by Alexander the Great, the Romans, the Crusaders under Richard the Lionheart, and Napoleon Bonaparte, had been under Ottoman rule for about 300 years. But in the 1830s, the ancient and once feared Ottoman Empire was in decline. Acre and the province of Syria were under threat. And not from one of the usual European imperial suspects such as Britain, France or Russia, but from an emerging African power which was threatening to redraw the map of the Middle East. Our story begins with the ambitious Albanian-born Ottoman officer named Muhammad Ali, known in Turkish as Mehmet Ali. Appointed Pasha or Viceroy of the Ottoman-ruled Egypt in 1805, Muhammad Ali was no ordinary provincial governor. In something akin to a storyline from Game of Thrones, he massacred the Mamluk warrior class who'd ruled the country for 600 years at a banquet. And by 1839, he had transformed himself from a loyal vassal into the Ottoman Empire's greatest internal threat. Muhammad Ali had built a westernised army trained by former French officers, constructed a formidable fleet, and effectively ruled Egypt as an independent sovereign. His ambitions, however, extended far beyond the Nile Valley. His son, Ibrahim Pasha, had invaded Syria in 1832, and Constantinople was only saved thanks to Russian military intervention. By 1839, the Egyptian forces controlled vast territories that rightfully belonged to the Ottoman Sultan. That year, the Ottoman Empire attempted to reclaim these lost provinces. The result was catastrophic. On June the 24th, at the Battle of Nezib, the Ottoman army was utterly defeated by Ibrahim Pasha's Egyptian forces. The Ottoman capital, Constantinople, once more lay at their mercy. To compound this disaster, the Ottoman Sultan died just days later, leaving the empire in the hands of his 16-year-old heir. And as if matters couldn't deteriorate further, the Ottoman fleet now promptly defected to the Egyptians, sailing for Alexandria. The empire that had once struck fear into the hearts of European capitals was collapsing from within. This crisis could not be contained within Ottoman borders. The European powers had vital interests at stake. Britain, Russia, Austria and Prussia had all pledged to support Ottoman territorial integrity, fearing that the empire's collapse would create a dangerous power vacuum. France, however, supported Muhammad Ali, not out of any particular fondness for the Egyptian Pasha, but for reasons of imperial strategy. Having recently conquered Algeria from the Ottoman Empire, France saw advantage in a weakened Ottoman state that could facilitate further expansion in North Africa. On the 15th of July 1840, Britain, Austria, Russia and Prussia signed a treaty with the Ottomans. They would support Constantinople and told Muhammad Ali to vacate most of Syria along with his conquests in Arabia and the island of Crete. In return, he would be granted hereditary rule over Egypt and lifetime administration of the city of Acre. Muhammad Ali's response was defiant. "What I have won by the sword, I will maintain by the sword." He refused to withdraw his forces. The four powers' bluff had been called, and now they were left with no choice but to back their ultimatum with force. A fleet consisting of Austrian, Turkish and Royal Navy battleships was assembled under the command of Admiral Sir Robert Stopford. Now, Austria's participation might seem surprising to modern audiences, accustomed to thinking of Austria as a landlocked Central European state. But until 1918, the Habsburg Empire controlled a large swathe of territory along the Adriatic coast in what is now Croatia and Italy. The Austrian navy was a significant force. By 1914, it would comprise of over 100 vessels of various types, with 20,000 men serving in it. Anyway, back to the story. From his flagship, the 104-gun HMS Princess Charlotte, Admiral Stopford ordered Commodore Charles Napier to proceed to the Syrian coast with a small squadron in June 1840. Napier was born in 1786 and had joined the Royal Navy in 1799, serving with distinction throughout the Napoleonic Wars. He had participated in the capture of Martinique in the Caribbean and built a reputation as a fearless leader during the War of 1812, including the attack on Baltimore. Napier was a character worthy of the age, a naval officer of exceptional skill and bravery, but questionable discipline, a man who seemed constitutionally incapable of serving under anyone else but himself. Napier arrived off the city of Beirut in modern-day Lebanon on August the 11th, 1840, on board his flagship, HMS Powerful. It would soon live up to its name. The city was held by 11,000 Egyptian troops, plus 4,000 Turkish soldiers from the defected fleet. They were commanded by Suleiman Pasha, a former French soldier. As Joseph Sèvres, Suleiman Pasha had fought at the Battle of Waterloo, but for the past decade had been in the employ of Muhammad Ali. And if you were wondering where the French support for the Egyptian Pasha was, well, they took one look at that international coalition, including Prussia and Russia, and decided to quietly sit on the sidelines. Napier's approach was characteristically direct. He called upon the Egyptian garrison to surrender and leave Syria. When this demand was refused, he imposed a blockade and waited for reinforcements. The breakthrough for Napier came from an unexpected quarter. Beirut's population, particularly the Maronite Christians of Lebanon, rose in revolt against their Egyptian occupiers. On September the 11th, Napier bombarded Beirut, whilst British Marines and Turkish troops conducted a joint landing. The Egyptians, facing both naval gunfire and urban insurgency, could not mount an effective defence. But despite that handicap, they did hold on to the city or parts of it for nearly a month. In the meantime, on September the 17th, the port of Tyre was taken with no losses, another coastal position systematically removed from Egyptian control. At this point, our story takes an interesting turn. Brigadier General Sir Charles Felix Smith had been specially selected to command the Allied land forces going ashore from the fleet. Smith, born in 1786, was a Royal Engineers officer commissioned in 1802, with extensive service in the Caribbean and the Peninsular War. A renowned duellist, he'd actually killed 3 Frenchmen whilst in Paris shortly after the Napoleonic Wars. He'd then held several governorships in the West Indies, and in 1838 was appointed acting governor and commander of forces in Gibraltar. Smith had actually arrived at Beirut on September the 1st, 1840, but illness prevented him from taking charge during the initial operations. Napier, ever eager to be in the limelight, took control of both the naval and the land operations. When Smith finally recovered and was deemed fit for duty, Stopford ordered Napier to relinquish command of the land forces. Napier's response was characteristic. He simply ignored the order. The fleet was now directed against Sidon, defended by 2,700 men in a fort and citadel that served as the main ammunition dump for the Egyptian army's southern division. On September the 26th, 1840, Napier commanded a mixed squadron of British, Turkish and Austrian warships in what would prove to be one of the campaign's most hard-fought actions. The initial naval bombardment was led by HMS Thunderer, a 2-deck, 84-gun ship of the line. Despite being launched just 9 years before in 1831, this wooden, sail-powered battleship was not significantly different to the Royal Naval vessels used during the Napoleonic Wars. But times were changing. Here at Sidon, Thunderer was supported by 4 new steam-powered vessels, HMS Cyclops, Gorgon, Stromboli and Vesuvius. Not dependent on the winds, they offered a flexibility in attack that the Royal Navy had hitherto never had before. Following a half-hour bombardment, Captain Horatio Thomas Austin landed with Turkish troops, but found the Egyptian garrison unshaken by the naval gunfire. The defenders were well positioned and determined to hold their ground. Napier ordered the bombardment to resume with increased intensity, and then made, depending on your point of view, a bold, heroic or foolhardy decision. Placing himself at the head of 750 British Royal Marines, 500 Turks and 100 Austrians, he personally led the assault against the fortress city. It was exactly the kind of bold, reckless leadership that characterised his entire career. Breaking through the walls under heavy fire, his forces seized the citadel in fierce hand-to-hand fighting. Napier's personal leadership in the assault became legendary amongst his men, although it nearly resulted in his court-martial for the continued disobedience of orders. His victory, however, probably saved him from that court-martial. Admiral Stopford, proving himself a forgiving commander, wrote a generous letter of praise to his insubordinate subordinate. By November 1840, only one major coastal position remained in Egyptian hands, the ancient fortress of Acre, known to crusaders as St. Jean d'Acre. The city, which had been under Ottoman rule for 300 years, had been occupied by Egyptian forces in 1837, and Ibrahim Pasha's engineers had worked tirelessly to make it impregnable. 130 guns and 30 mortars were positioned behind the massive stone walls that had defied attackers for centuries. The garrison numbered 4,500 infantry and 800 cavalry, commanded by experienced officers who had every confidence in their defences. Admiral Stopford himself now decided to oversee the bombardment of this key target. On October the 31st, he assembled his formidable force at Beirut. 8 British ships of the line, 5 frigates, 5 steamers and 2 brigs, 20 British vessels in total, mounting over 700 guns. And supporting this Royal Navy squadron were 4 Austrian warships and 2 Turkish vessels. It represented one of the most powerful naval forces assembled in the Eastern Mediterranean during the 19th century. They arrived off Acre on November the 2nd, and Stopford spent a day studying the defences and positioning his fleet. The Egyptians watched confidently from their walls, secure in the knowledge that Acre had successfully resisted even Napoleon Bonaparte himself in 1799. But they were about to learn that naval warfare had changed dramatically in the intervening 4 decades. The British admiral, who had vacated his flagship for HMS Phoenix in order to supervise the battle, now divided his force into 2 divisions. Napier, in HMS Powerful, led the 1st Division, attacking the western end of the mighty citadel. He was followed by HMS Princess Charlotte, Thunderer, Bellerophon and Revenge. The 2nd Division, including Stopford's steam-powered vessels, the remainder of the Royal Navy battleships, along with the Austrian and Turkish contingents, attacked from the south. At 2 p.m. on November the 3rd, 1840, Admiral Stopford gave the order to commence firing. The British fleet had anchored at less than 800 metres from shore, point-blank range for naval artillery. It was a bold and crucial decision. The Egyptians had elevated their guns expecting a long-range engagement, and now they could not depress their cannons sufficiently to hit Stopford's ships. The bombardment was methodical and devastating. Modern naval artillery firing at close range, systematically demolishing fortifications that had stood for centuries. The Egyptian return fire was largely ineffective, their elevated guns overshooting their targets. And then, at 4:20 p.m, came the decisive moment. A British shell penetrated the main magazine in the city centre. The explosion was tremendous. Over 1,000 Egyptian defenders died instantly, and the blast could be heard for miles. The psychological impact was immediate and complete. The remaining Egyptian batteries, what was left of them, fell silent. Stopford's combined fleet had fired 48,000 rounds in just over 2 hours. That evening, Austrian Marines, led by 19-year-old Archduke Friedrich of the ruling Habsburg dynasty, landed and took control of the citadel. The Egyptian defenders, demoralised by that devastating bombardment, fled before his advance. As an aside, Friedrich was the cousin once removed of the future Emperor Franz Joseph, who would lead Austria-Hungary into the First World War. The disparity in casualties at the Bombardment of Acre was staggering. British losses totalled just 18 killed and 41 wounded. Turkish allies lost just 4 men killed, with several wounded. Against this, the Egyptians suffered over 1,000 dead from the magazine explosion alone, plus 300 more killed by the bombardment. With Syrian coastal positions in Allied hands, Muhammad Ali now found that the tables had been turned. The collapse of his army in Syria now threatened to undermine his control of Egypt itself. And ironically, this presented the British with a new problem. They could not allow Egypt to fall into complete chaos, not least because the French might use their presence both in the country and in Algeria to add Egypt to their empire. So now, in a bizarre twist, the British, having preserved the Ottoman Sultan, now decided to preserve Muhammad Ali in power as well. Admiral Stopford ordered Napier to Alexandria to observe the situation. Arriving on November the 21st aboard HMS Powerful, Napier established a blockade of the Egyptian port. Then, with characteristic independence and no official authority whatsoever, he went ashore and entered into direct negotiations with Muhammad Ali. In return for Ibrahim Pasha's complete vacation of Syria, Muhammad Ali and his descendants would enjoy hereditary rule over Egypt, an unprecedented concession for an Ottoman vassal. Recognising that he had overstepped his authority, Napier wrote to his wife with typical bravado, "I shall either be hung by the government or made a bishop." Napier's unauthorised diplomacy caused outrage in Constantinople and London, but interestingly, the substance of his agreement became the foundation of the final settlement signed by all parties in November that year. In that treaty, Muhammad Ali renounced his claims to all of Syria, including Acre, Crete and Arabia, but gained what he most wanted: hereditary rule over Egypt and Sudan for his dynasty. That dynasty ruled Egypt until 1952, when King Farouk, his great-great-grandson, was overthrown in the Egyptian Revolution. Despite his maverick actions in the campaign, Napier was knighted and made an aide-de-camp (ADC) to Queen Victoria. He received a hero's welcome on his return to Britain and entered Parliament. Ultimately, he became the commander of the Channel Fleet before commanding the Baltic campaign during the Crimean War. I've recently told the story of that campaign, so maybe check it out at the end. Already in his 70s, the Oriental Crisis, as it was known at the time, culminating in the Bombardment of Acre, was Admiral Stopford's last action. After a career at sea lasting 60 years, he was made governor of the Greenwich Hospital, the Royal Navy equivalent of the Royal Hospital in Chelsea, home of the Chelsea pensioners. He died in 1847 and was buried in the hospital cemetery. Interestingly, the Bombardment of Acre resulted in the first General Campaign Medal issued to Royal Navy sailors. But strangely, that medal came not from the British Admiralty, but from the Ottoman Sultan in 1841. It was struck in 3 grades: gold for commanding officers, silver for lower-ranking officers and warrant officers, and 9,700 copper medals for other ranks. This Ottoman recognition may have spurred the British Admiralty to action, because just 2 years later, after the First Opium War in 1843, Royal Navy personnel were issued with the China War Medal. The Oriental Crisis of 1840 and the Bombardment of Acre are pretty much a footnote in a region which has seen so much violence over the centuries. But it is an interesting and little-known campaign, very much overshadowed by the Crimean War and Indian Mutiny. Crossover moment between Nelson's navy and a modern industrial navy. It also demonstrated how regional conflicts in an interconnected world can draw in other great powers, and still do to this day. Finally, it's also a very good example of how complex political situations and manoeuvring rapidly make today's enemy tomorrow's friend, and vice versa. And that too continues to this day. Well, thanks for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed that story. Plenty more for you to choose from on my channel, and loads more coming your way. In the meantime, a big thanks to my patrons and members. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.